Welcome to part 2 of how to paint a fantastic fawn using watercolor. First, we're going to start with a draw and drag technique. We're going to do this by getting our smallest paintbrush damp. We want it kind of like a little bit of water to it, not too wet, not too dry. Kind of like towel wet hair after you towel dried your hair. And you're going to gather up that paint on the bristles of your brush, and you're going to gather it up until you start seeing brown on your brush. And then you're going to want to start outlining the outside of your fawn's body. So as you're outlining the fawn's body and kind of like the really dark brown parts of your fawn, you're going to want to continue doing this until your paint starts running out on your brush. When it starts running out, you're going to start kind of getting like splotchy color. It's not going to be very it's not going to spread as easily. You're going to get kind of like white showing through on your paper, and your paint is going to look faded. When it gets to that point, you're going to pause and switch to your medium brush. Get your medium brush damp and start pulling in that brown that you have just established on your paper. Do not continue outlining. Work on one section at a time. Time is of the essence here. You want to work while that painted outline, is still wet. Now, watercolor paper has a tendency to dry quickly, so only work on one section at a time. I would recommend working from top to bottom. That way you know that when you finish the bottom, your top will probably be dry at that point, and you can start working from the top to the bottom again with other details. This will also help you avoid smearing paint as well when working with your watercolor piece. Now, if you want to go for kind of three-dimensional effect, like let's say the left-hand side of your fawn's body is darker than the front part of your fawn's body, and you kind of want that left-hand side to gradually or have like a gradual increase of lightness from left to right, you can add another layer of paint on that side and then continue to do that drag and pull technique that I taught you earlier in class. This will kind of get it where you have shadow wrapping around the head of your fawn. It's going to emphasize a realistic kind of viewpoint of your watercolor piece. And you can also start adding some shadow or some darkness to the undersides of your ears. Now, you can always go back and add another layer of paint or redefine that outline when necessary. We were just using the original outline that we put down as a way to kind of regulate how much paint we're using and how much water we're using. It's a controlled way to paint or fill in an area if you're working on building values or light to dark. So feel free to do this to the other side too if you kind of want your fawn to have like a three-dimensional effect. All right, now that we have covered the basics of the pull and drag technique, let's practice this technique with the rest of the fawn's body, working from top to bottom in sections. Remember, we're using a damp brush for our outline with lots and lots and lots of paint. And then when our paint runs out, we're switching to that medium-sized brush. We're dragging that layer of paint that we have established on the paper in towards the fawn's body using a damp medium brush with no paint. This is a mixture of dry on dry and kind of like a wash or a blend. So this is a mixture of two techniques, but it's fantastic for filling in shapes with the same kind of consistency of color within a quick and easy and an efficient fashion. Now, if you need time to finish your fawn's body, you can pause this video. Remember, it's a fade in, fade out sequence. So when I start fading in, I am moving on to the next step. And when I'm starting to fade out, we're finishing that step. So if you need time, pause. If you don't, feel free to continue. So I'm almost done with my fawn. However, my fawn's body, the bottom half of the body is a lot wider than the actual head and the neck of the fawn itself. So there's going to be some times when you come across this pull and drag technique that you might actually start running out of watercolor paint, especially if the shape is a lot larger than other shapes. So in this situation, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take that medium brush that is still damp, the one that doesn't necessarily have paint on it, and you're just going to want to put a dot of brown on the corner of that brush. Put it on the area where you're running out of paint and use the water inside the brush that you have to spread that paint around to fill in that white spot that needs that layer of brown that you did not have enough of to begin with. Just go slow. It's really easy to add too much paint, so just go slow. A little bit of paint at a time is a lot easier to work with than too much paint at a time. If you have too much paint at a time, just try to dab it off. Maybe try to pick it up with your brush and scrape it off on your water cup. But just a little dot should do. And if it doesn't, you can always add another dot if need be. Okay, so now we have most of the deer's body filled in. It's time to redefine those outlines using our small brush and lots of brown paint. You really want to make sure that that hip pops. So let's add some brown to the hip area, some darker brown to the undersides of your ears, maybe to the undersides of your legs as well, to really center your fawn and give it kind of grounding, so to speak. This will help establish your fawn in a three-dimensional setting because you're using shadow underneath the body of the fawn itself. As I was outlining the body of my fawn, the center and the inside of my fawn was drying. So I am now ready to add my dots or my speckles for my fawn. Now, I'm going to use a technique that is similar to palette painting, where I am literally taking a gob of watercolor and I am putting it on the surface of my paper, and there should literally be a little bump of watercolor paint. I am doing this because I need a lot of white and I kind of need a pool or maybe a dot of white paint in order for it to stand out against my brown paint. Now, if you feel more comfortable using a tiny brush and using acrylic for this part, you can, but you can still use the watercolor. You're just going to have to use a lot more white than you think would be necessary. So let's put in those speckles and then move on to the next step. So currently at this time, I do not have a tan color. So I'm going to make a tan color. But if you have a tan color, then I recommend using a very thin wash of it for the rest of your fawn's body. Obviously not the eyes, nose, and mouth, or the hooves, but preferably for the face and the ears, or the inside of the ears. Now, if you are stuck like I am with yellow and brown, then you can make a tan. So I am going to do this by using my small brush, and I'm going to clean it out very well, and I am going to use a thin layer of water, very thin, because I don't want that color to start bleeding into the highlights inside my deer's eyes. If you use too much water, it's going to splooge everywhere. And I'm going to add a thin layer to the fawn's face where I have not painted yet. I'm going to use that layer to help spread a dot of yellow across my fawn's face. And then I'm going to add a very tiny dot. Obviously, I'll clean my brush first, but then I'm going to add a tiny dot of brown to the yellow, and I'm going to move it around using that thin layer of water that I have put on the paper before I even began using paint. This is called blending with a wash. So this is a wash of yellow, and then I'm blending brown into it. This is how I'm creating a tan. However, if you have tan, just go with tan. This is a lot more of a complex technique, and it is less likely to be easily controlled than your tan color on your palette. I, however, do not have that option. So bear with me as I do this. As you can see, now that my tan has been put down on the paper, I might have to reestablish some of my brown around the edges of my fawn's ear. I'm going to do this by repeating the drag and pull technique that I mentioned earlier, but I'm just strictly going to use brown at this point, and I'm only going to focus on the outside of my fawn's ears. As I'm doing this, my paint on my face should dry and become dry enough once I'm finished to start working on my eyes. When you begin to start working on those beautiful eyes, you're going to want to choose a very small brush. This is the smallest brush that I have, and you can even see as I'm painting the eyes, I'm having difficulty keeping the highlight parts of my eyes white because my brush is so wide. So small brush is going to do you a lot of favors at this point. Go in with a slightly damp brush that is super clean with a thick layer of black paint. You don't want any of that brown mixing in at this point. And kind of work your way around the highlight spots. I almost found that maybe dotting or dabbing with your brush is also helpful. And at this point, you want to make sure that your brush is very little water, lots of paint, because if you have more water, then your water will start splooging into the highlights of your eyes, and we don't want that. No. Now that, my friend, is how you can create a fantastic fawn using watercolor. Now, I challenge you to make your own background piece for your fawn using the techniques that we focused on in class. But first, let your fawn dry before you continue. For more tips and tricks, please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel at Carly's Colorful Corner or follow us on Facebook. Until then, I look forward to seeing you in the classroom.